psychology. Already.
Oh.
Over chapter 7 and 8. We're finishing chapter 7 today on memory.
I won't get it.
Here.
My legs are kind of sitting.
Are you staying after school on Tuesday? For soccer? Yeah. We have a soccer game at 3, so we'll be here though.
So, please open your books to page 268.
Aye, aye, Captain.
I have a little
Who are we missing? Can you help me out with that?
Trey,
Four people
Carson,
missing.
Trey, Carson, McLean,
Is it still Vanessa?
and Vanessa.
Why is it so hard?
I got half of them.
It's red. I got a pen.
Me too.
I don't care. You won't get one more pen.
Yeah, he did very Ellen did there.
This is pretty much the worst video ever made.
I'm blushing so much.
Forecast for tomorrow. A few sprinkles of genius with a chance of doom.
Turns out they're really tame.
Really? For some reason I thought that, I've seen some
Candy?
I'm loving that movie. What's that scene that makes your skin
Okay.
Oh, really? Basically, you just don't want to lose your head.
There's a word you need to know.
So funny.
It's called encoding. Encoding. Encoding is how you put something into memory. If I tell you that the hypothalamus is a brain part involved in emotion, we would say that's impoverished encoding. Impoverished meaning poor. Not very good. Basically, we haven't made a lot of connections to other things that you know. Elaborate encoding, if I say the hypothalamus is a brain part connected with the limbic system, it's involved in emotion. It's located under the thalamus. Hypo means under, you see. The hypothalamus is under the thalamus. It's active when you're mad or afraid. It's involved in hunger and thirst and other survival drive. It helps regulate the temperature of your body. It sends messages to your pituitary gland, part of your autonomic nervous system. These are all connections you're making to hypothalamus, and that, we say, is an elaborate type of encoding. You're making many connections. Let me go back to where we talked about that you have a form, some sort of system where you make connections between things in your long-term memory. The more connections you have, the easier it is to place something in this framework. And the easier it is to retrieve something from the framework later, the more connections you have. You're more likely to run across one of the connections, and that will lead you to the idea that you're looking for. So, encoding is storing something. And the more connections you have, the more elaborate that encoding is. Rehearsal is something you can do to store something in your memory. If somebody gives you a phone number, do you remember my buddy's phone number that I grew up with? Anyone remember it? Puck's phone number?
867. There's an 8 and a 5 in it, right?
It's 265. I just remember that.
That was it. 265-7052. That's Putt Otten's phone number.
We got a super genius over here.
Now, one way you store it in the long term, which you obviously did, is you can rehearse it, saying it over and over. If somebody gives you the phone number, okay, 265-7052, 265. You say it several times over and over, you're more likely to remember it. How did you remember it? Did you have
I didn't even say the number that you just said. I said something like it.
Oh, okay. I misheard it. You must have had something in there just to say a number close.
That's what the number you just made us remember though.
Really? Okay. Maintenance rehearsal is what just rote repetition. And you can maintain it in your memory for a longer time because your short-term memory lasts for how long? Do you remember?
About 30 seconds.
About 30 seconds. Very good. And so it'll run out, but if you repeat it within that 30 seconds, you can add another 30 seconds. You can maintain it in the short-term memory. That's called a maintenance rehearsal. Elaborative rehearsal is if you're not only saying the number. I often do this when I'm saying my number. My phone number is 222-6797. And I tell my golfers, y'all don't forget my number in case you're ever late to practice. Make sure you call me, 222-6797. 222 is easy enough to remember. 6797, 67, what I shoot on 18 holes. 97, what y'all shoot on 18 holes.
Oh, burn.
And they always remember it from there on after because that is a form of elaborative rehearsal. I'm associating new information with the already stored knowledge. The new information is the new phone number. The already stored knowledge is what's a good score on golf, 67 is a real good score on golf. What's a bad score on golf, 97 is a bad score on golf. I also make a joke out of it to add some emotion to it because you tend to remember things better that were under emotional circumstances. And then you got it. Y'all will probably remember that too if you know anything about golf. And please don't be calling me. I've got already enough of that. How about a mnemonic device? Have you ever heard that word?
Yes, I have. Please.
Mnemonics are little things like Columbus. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean. It's a little trick to make you remember things better. There's all sorts of mnemonic devices. Have y'all ever heard of an acronym?
Did Kari Presley come over for
Spaghetti.
He's talking about memorizing.
Did Kari Presley come over for wait.
Did Kari come over for
Oh, never mind.
Did King
Forgot the phylum.
what?
Oh,
Did King
Kari
Philip
Presley.
come over from Germany slowly? That's one to memorize the levels of taxonomy in biology.
Well, it's Kari Presley, not Kate
Domain,
Phillips.
kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, or specific epithet. What's another one?
Great spaghetti.
My very excited mother just served us 9.
My very excited mother just served us 9 pizzas, is what it used to be.
Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally.
Yeah, this was when Pluto was a planet.
What's PEMDAS?
Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn,
Parentheses,
Uranus. SOHCAHTOA, yeah.
Foil.
Foil.
Some old hippie caught another hippie tripping on acid.
Foil.
Sine is the opposite over hypotenuse.
Full.
Sine is adjacent over the
Full.
hypotenuse. Tangent is the opposite over the adjacent.
Full. How about full?
These are all mnemonics tricks to help you learn things. I had a friend in college who could make up a dirty mnemonic for everything he had to memorize.
You remember any?
I can't tell you any of them. They were that dirty.
We won't tell anyone.
How do you think I did?
And you could just say, Pete, make up a dirty mnemonic for this, and he'd have it.
Haha.
Real fast. He was good. He's smart.
If Ridge was here, I'd.
Would they help? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. You never forgot, did you see his dirty mnemonic?
I'll tell you the
I
mnemonic
can't
later.
tell you. They're too dirty.
Pick a tape.
I really cannot.
Seriously?
I remember them, but I'm not able
Okay,
to tell
write
them.
them. We'll just read them.
Can you like whisper them?
No.
Let's do like telephone.
Let's talk about forgetting.
Oh, not forgetting.
In psychology, we call forgetting of information decay. Decay theory says that information in memory eventually disappears if it's not accessed. If you don't remember something often, like you remember my number there, but if you don't access that memory for a long period of time, you may forget it. A certain percentage of your memory will decay over time, and this has been studied in a lot of different ways. A guy named Herman Ebbinghaus, he memorized what's called nonsense syllables. He made up a bunch of nonsense words like blah, glee, fly, prove, greed, and he'd memorize them, and then he'd test himself to see how well he memorized this list of nonsense syllables, and to see how well he could remember it later, and he'd test himself every hour or every day or something like that for a certain amount of time. And then he made a graph of his forgetting curve, and that looked like this. Just if he tests himself just a few minutes later, he had memorized almost 100% of the terms. 20 minutes later, only 58% he would know. An hour later, only 44% he would know. 9 hours later, 38%. And so forth. This is kind of like when people walk into class and I got a quiz, I'm like, give me the quiz, because they just studied it, just memorized it, and they're going to lose it quickly over time. But even 31 days later, a month later, he would know 28% of the nonsense syllables. So it seemed like it kind of leveled out at about 28%. Now this is just for him. This was in his own little experiment. This type of curve might differ in somebody else. And you would probably retain a lot more if it's something that's not nonsense, like a bunch of syllables that don't mean anything. If it's biology material, you would probably retain more than 28% because that's not nonsense. Some of the biology does make sense to some extent. But that's some interesting experiment Ebbinghaus did that you'll read about if you read your section, which some of you will. Some of you just won't do it. There's another lady that did experiments like this. Her name was Marigold Linton. And she took a diary and wrote down everything that happened. And then she tried to remember what happened on certain days and had a way of testing herself over what happened. And she noticed that she remembered some things but didn't remember others. And her retention for personal events gradually fell off over a period of years. And you can see she remembered 100% of major events in her lifetime, but she found that 6 years later, she only remembered about 70% of these events that happened in her life that she kept close tab of in her diaries. So there is some kind of decay. No matter what scientists are doing these experiments, we do see some decay in memory. And you don't, although some memories do last forever, a lot don't, and you lose a lot of them. Students' names, I could probably plot a curve like that for me. A lot of students I do remember many years later, but some I forget.
Do you remember what my name is?
Michael?
Yes.
That's good. But you know, you come here 6 years from now, I might have forgotten you.
Well, I'll be
Don't feel bad. There's just so many kids. It's only so much that can fit in there. I want to remember all of y'all. What I need to do is keep studying you year after year.
It's a little creepy. That's my old supervisor.
Retroactive interference versus proactive interference. I could read you these, but it's kind of confusing. It's easier to see this. Which is also kind of confusing because for some reason it's been repeated twice. What's written here is the same thing that's written there. Isn't that confusing? I don't know why I have it like that. Just pay attention to up here. Here's retroactive interference. You go to a party and you meet a girl named Julie. Later at the same party, you meet a girl named Judy. Judy can interfere with Julie. And so later when you see Julie, you call her Judy. Has this ever happened to you before? We call that retroactive interference. What you learn later interferes with something you learned before and can even take the place of it. You probably run into this type of stuff when you're studying all the time and don't realize that it happens. But you call a person you learned earlier by a name you heard later, and it just messes the whole thing up. It can also happen the other way. If you meet Julie first, then you meet Judy later, then at a later point you see Judy and you call her Julie. See, both things can happen. It's not like, oh, this is the only thing that happens. Sometimes it happens this way. It's called retroactive interference if something you learned later interferes with something you learned earlier. And it's called proactive interference when something you learned earlier interferes with something you learned later. Both of those things happen all the time. Judy, Julie.
They're all the same.
Judy, Judy, Judy. You know what that's from? No, that's a movie with, no one knows that, Preston?
It sounds familiar.
Judy, Judy, Judy. That's an imitation that was joke of, and I can't remember the name. Sorry. I forget. Cue-dependent forgetting. Sometimes you need cues, something to cue your memory.
What?
A cue is something that the memory goes with that kind of spurs on your memory about something. You probably wouldn't remember my phone number, except I gave you the cue to remember it. The golf cue. And now you can remember my phone number because there's a cue, something to cue your memory. Have you ever heard that term, cue your memory? What's my phone number? Do you remember?
6797.
That's right. By giving you the cue helps you retrieve the information. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in
1892.
1492. The cue is the run.
I didn't.
State-dependent memory. This is interesting. If you learn something when you're happy, you probably would recall it better in a happy mood. A friend of mine said he had to drink before he went to class, before he went to take the test, because when he learned the information, he was drunk. And he remembers it better when he's drunk. And so that's why he was going to class. That's why he was drinking before his test. This was a friend in college.
Did it work?
No, he failed out. But that's what he really said.
He was serious?
Oh, yeah. He said, I got a test coming up. I got to get drunk. You bring some beer. And we're like, what? And he's like, well, when I learned this stuff, I was drunk.
Makes sense to me.
Was he majoring in psychology?
But it is true that if you remember something, if you're in the same state you were when you heard the material, you will more likely remember it. Now, it probably doesn't work with drinking, but it probably does with mood, and that's
only one way
it
to
definitely
find out.
does with mood. It works with classroom settings. If you learn the material in here, you're more likely to do better on a test over the material if you took the test in here. We call that kind of thing state dependent, because if you're in the same state, if you're in the same location even, if you have the same cues, because you might remember, oh yeah, he was talking about that, I remember this thing on the screen. It helps you if the screen is there than if you're trying to come up with items and you're in a whole different state. The book goes on and on about this. There's a whole page, I think, on it. Amnesia, have you ever heard that?
Yep.
Amnesia means loss of memory.
It's a video game.
And often you see somebody gets hit on the head and they forget stuff. It usually doesn't work like that. Although sometimes we've noticed that in traumatic experiences, if there's a bad car wreck, or an explosion, or something like that, or if there's been a murder, you've seen a crime, often people forget things right around that time period. A person who gets in a bad car wreck usually won't remember anything about the wreck, because it was so traumatic. Often that's sometimes buried away from your memory. Sometimes people come up with it later. That they can remember details, but much later after the trauma, after they've kind of gotten over the bad experience. What were you going to say?
Never mind. It's not important.
Childhood amnesia is big. We all have missing years. And you probably don't have a memory of yourself before about 4 years old, 3 years old. Somewhere in there is when you start to being able to remember. And then everybody's missing those years in between. If you do have a memory from when you're 2 years old and 1 year old, it's more likely that it's not a real memory than it is. Now, some people might be able to actually have a real memory from 2 or 1 years old, but it's very likely that's not the case.
I read an article about a guy, I think it was in brain surgery, that they simulated part of his brain and he remembered his own birth. Is that possible?
Probably not.
Really?
It's probably a fake memory that he thinks is real.
Okay.
That he saw birth on TV and now is thinking that's his own memory.
Not want that memory.
It's probably not a real memory. But why is this? Why does childhood amnesia happen? Nobody really knows, because we don't understand how memory works. But there are different theories. There are cognitive explanations, which has to do with how you think and how you store memory. Some scientists think that memories are stored in a certain way, in a certain code when you're a kid. And that coding changes when you start getting a little bit older. When you start getting into age 3 and 4, they think you might store memories different. So it's like, for instance, you store them as Morse code as a kid, and you then start storing them as sign language or written word when you get older.
Braille.
And then you learn how to retrieve your memories from the written word, and you forget how to retrieve them from the Morse code. So maybe they're in there somewhere, but you just don't know how to retrieve them anymore. That's one of the theories. And that helps explain, for a while, you're able to retrieve using both. So at age 5, you can remember stuff that happened at age 2. But at age 7, you can no longer remember stuff that happened at age 2. Scientists don't really understand why childhood amnesia happens. But if you go on and read in your book, you'll see there's a few pages that talk about that. Okay, read through the end of the chapter. I want to start this video. We're not going to be able to finish it, but it's chapter 7 and 8, tomorrow's psychology. You might want to review to do well on psychology. Yes?
Should I use the bathroom one?
Yes. This is a video of a guy with an unbelievable